Yes. Okay, great. So we will get started. Hello and welcome to the first session in the Interfaith Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence's four-part Domestic Violence Awareness Month series. This discussion will be recorded and emailed to everyone who registered for the series. Before I turn the discussion over to the moderator and IC member, Rahmah Abdulaleem, I wanted to introduce myself and the Interfaith Coalition. My name is Dorian Karp, and I'm the Senior Advocacy and Policy Manager at Jewish Women International. Our work at JWI is focused around empowering women and girls and ending gender-based violence. We do this work in the secular, interfaith, and Jewish space. JWI first convened the Interfaith Coalition in 2007, and now it represents 40 faith-based organizations who come together to work to end violence against women and girls with a focus mainly on impacting and effectuating change through federal legislative advocacy. This month, we're hosting this four-part series that'll look at the intersection of race, religion, and domestic violence. Thank you for entering the space today, and I look forward to seeing you in the subsequent sessions. Now I'm going to turn it over to Rahmah.
Good afternoon and good morning for people on the
You are
West
on
Coast.
mute, or I can't hear you.
I'm not on mute. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me now. Okay. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what coast you're on. Thank you for joining us for this first part of our four-part series on systemic racism in the DV context. My name is Rahmah Abdulaleem, and I'm the Executive Director of KARAMAH, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights, the oldest women-led Muslim nonprofit in the United States. I am joined today by a stellar panel who is going to share with you some of the intersections between race and DV and religion this afternoon or this morning. First, we have Qudsia Raja, the Vice President of Policy and Equity Initiatives at the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and she also serves on the boards of the Community Justice Action Fund and the Collective Action for Safe Spaces. In addition, we have the Reverend Dr. Sarai S, who is an ordained minister, a social justice advocate, and an author. Dr. Crain was appointed the Deputy Chief of Violence Prevention by the City of Oakland in the summer of 2020. Prior to her current appointment, she served as the Executive Director of the Bay Area Women Against Rape, the nation's oldest rape crisis center. So I really want to start this conversation off with just you guys giving us a brief description of an example between the intersection of DV and race. Because so often people are like, is there an intersection? You know, isn't rape, or, you know, isn't domestic violence, sexual violence? And really, if you guys could give us an example of the intersection between the two. But before they give the example, I please want to make sure I give the trigger warning that we are talking about something that is very sensitive and might be triggering for some people. Keep in mind the topics that we're talking about today. It is domestic violence, it is sexual violence, so please take care of your mental health. So, you know, Dr. Crain, if you could get us started, please give us an example of the intersection between domestic violence and race.
Well, thank you. And first of all, I want to say thank you for being invited to this space. This is content and conversations that I think are really important and critical to have, not just in October, but I'm grateful that October provides an excuse and an opportunity for us to really center the discourse. So I just want to say thank you to you, Dorian, and to you, Rahmah, and honored to be serving alongside Qudsia. Pleasure to meet you virtually. So to answer your question, I feel like I could be talking about this, and I'm really thankful to be talking about this because from my context, you know, I'm in the Bay Area, and I think people feel like, you know, when you're from California, you're in, you know, just liberal California. But the reality is that the movement, specifically around sexual violence and ending intimate partner violence, was really I would say in the United States started gaining more momentum because white women finally came out about it in the 70s. And I think that where I really appreciate the efforts and the fierce advocacy and that legacy of, really unapologetic advocacy around ending intimate partner violence and centering it and naming it violence, right? Because I think a lot of intimate violence and domestic violence and gender-based violence has been relegated to these issues that happen in the home. And so, for years, systems and societally, we've just kind of kept it, like that's, people's private business. And so I really am grateful and honor the legacy of, many, very courageous, white feminists and authors and authorities that were bold enough to talk about it. But the reality is that white feminism didn't often center the unique experiences of women of color, Black folks, and Indigenous folks. And in this country, it's to me, I can't take you seriously if you don't. And I think the assumption that white women started the movement speaks to the levels of systemic racism that are embedded, within us just culturally. White women didn't start it, but white women were the ones that got hurt first. And so again, it's not to dismiss or to not appreciate the legacy, but it is to raise and center the fact that, Black and brown folks have been, addressing this, talking about it, standing against it, and advocating and caring for one another in a very ancestrally informed way. So to answer the question around the intersections, I think it's a really critical question to ask. And then we have to start thinking about the agencies, the organizations, and the centers that are responding to survivors of these types of violence. Like, what are they doing to be intentional around centering that discussion and discourse? So for example, what I noticed when I was working at BAWAR, Bay Area Women Against Rape, which by the way, I started my career doing this work as a crisis line volunteer. And, I was a broke grad student and just wanted to volunteer, and it ended up changing my life. At the time I was serving at a congregation in Oakland. It was actually a Black congregation, and I was really surprised to see the gap between how the church was not responding to survivors, and also the difference between what was happening with the agency that I was serving in. But the reason I go on this tangent is because what I noticed was that the individuals that were accessing our care, they came in different ways. And so you had folks that were coming into the emergency department that did, they had a right to have an advocate with them when they were providing their forensic statements to law enforcement. But what we started to see was that the majority, the data shows that really the individuals that were accessing the emergency department were really white women. And we weren't seeing the same level of engagement in the emergency department with Black and brown folks and with Indigenous folks. And that was a lot of times because they didn't want to have to deal with law enforcement. So legally, the way it works here in our county is law enforcement is the one who signs off on to authorize a forensic exam. So you can't get the exam and not be, liable for it financially unless law enforcement signs off on it. So essentially, in order to get services, you have to engage with law enforcement. Now, there are certain places in the state of California where you can have what's called an abbreviated sexual assault exam, or forensic exam, but in our county, that it's not like that. And so you have folks that are on the margins that don't have however many thousands of dollars it costs to get emergency attention or emergency medical care, that are not accessing the services because they don't believe that anyone in there is going to look like them. The probability is high that the law enforcement officer is not going to be female identified, is not going to be a person of color. The probability is highest that the physician's assistant or the medical team or clinicians that will be actually collecting the evidence are not going to look like them, or they have the fear of having to engage with a system that has historically been oppressive. And so I think that looking at the ways that we can, expand access and also challenge the data. We know that the data is conservative, but the data is conservative because people don't report. And I don't think that people don't report only because of shame. That is a huge piece of it, but it's because folks don't want to deal with systems that have been oppressive. They don't want to deal with systems where they've already lacked access. If you don't have medical coverage, if you don't have, your own, if you're not employed or have an employer that's paying for your medical coverage, or if you're an entrepreneur or you're working on your own, you have your own business, how are you going to access those kinds of services? And so I think that the conversation around the intersection is critical. It's something that I feel like advocates know in secret, but I'm glad that it's being raised in a context like this, where we can actually center it, identify it, talk to it, and really do the work of being intentional to change it.
Thank you. Qudsia?
Sure. I mean, I think Sarai covered it. Like, yeah, I was also, yeah. So similarly, I, also when I was thinking of an example, and I also work at the National DV Hotline, so there's so many stories. So I was like, yeah, I also don't want to necessarily speak to a specific story, but about that narrative. And just to even think about as a field, like what a great disservice we do to survivors in the way we talk about domestic violence by erasing race as a primary factor that impacts how survivors will experience violence and also whether they'll even have access to the systems in place to support them. So, exactly what Sarai was saying is that, you have systems in place, but can everybody access them equally? And so, yeah, in the US, the anti-violence movement has historically limited our understanding of domestic violence as something hyper-focused on gender only, when all of us, all of us here know that, that every identity that a survivor holds impacts the way that their survivorship looks and impacts how systems will respond to them as they try to seek safety. So it's never something you can take off, right? Like, so it's not, so for me, when I'm like, oh, it's at an intersection, I'm like, well, I can't take it off when I'm like navigating systems. So yeah, and what we know about race, particularly when talking about domestic violence, is that it often translates into you as a survivor not getting the same access to resources, not getting the same access to support. It means experiencing discrimination by law enforcement and the courts and even direct service providers. It means, and then to get more specific, it means for a lot of Black and brown women and Black and brown survivors that when law enforcement does show up at your door because of a DV call, that you'll be, often threatened with arrest or actually arrested, or because of implicit bias and racism that exists within, the systems. We also know that, so when we're talking about that intersection of DV and race, we know that Black survivors have a disproportionately high rate of homicide by intimate partners with the use of a gun as compared by white women. And I know that that's something that a lot of people, not a lot, well, we'll see it used in the field a particular way. And I always like to stress that this is not because violence is intrinsic in any specific community, like that's not an intrinsic part of any community, but that Black survivors just don't have the same access to resources and support. And I'll keep saying that over and over again. But yeah, if you're less likely to reach out to law enforcement and your lethality risks are high, yes, you're gonna see higher homicide rates, right? And this week in particular, as we're all learning more details about the story about Jonathan Price, who was murdered in Texas, he was intervening. He's a young Black man who was literally doing the right thing. He was intervening, he was saying something without engaging law enforcement, and somebody must have called law enforcement and they ended up killing him. And that's not an anomaly. Like, we see that happen so often. Yeah, and similarly, like when you add more layers of like what it means to, not just race, but then you're an immigrant, right? Like, so if you're an immigrant survivor, particularly without documentation, particularly Black immigrants, once again, safety just becomes a negotiation, right? So we often hear on our lines, immigrant survivors weigh in about the pros and cons, involving systems where they're trying to figure out the best way to stay safe. I was reading our story logs this morning, and saw a story about, and this is unfortunately such a common story, but was reading a story this morning about a young immigrant woman. She's originally from Central America. She's undocumented. She shared multiple forms of interpersonal violence. Her partner had threatened her with a gun a couple of times, had threatened to remove her kids. So all of the textbook, pieces playing in, but then the added layer of her race and her undocumented status meant that, and the advocate who's working with her, we use the crisis intervention model. So it's really like, how can we help you? Here are your resources. And she kept saying she didn't want to go to the police. And, the advocate had to work with her and basically employ like a harm reduction model and basically say, okay, well, under these violent conditions, how can you stay safe? And it's unfortunate that, all of the systems that we have funded in place to support survivors are not ones that so many can't access. So I'll leave on a bleak note.
Okay. And then KARAMAH Cottman has joined us, and she is the executive director of UJIMA, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community, and the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And she has more than 20 years of service to all survivors of domestic violence, access to resources they need. So KARAMAH, if you can give us an example of the intersection between DV and race as well.
Sure, and thank you all for having me. This is such an important conversation, particularly with the faith-based community, and so I really appreciate the opportunity. I just echo what my sisters Sarai and Qudsia have said already in terms of the intersection of race and domestic violence, and particularly for the community that we work with around and working with Black women and Black children. This is certainly just ever presenting in our realities. And so Qudsia talked about, issues related to homicide and lethality for Black women. I heard Sarai talking about the intersections around systems and systems involvement in the lives of Black women and systems response. And so where I'll sort of expand on that is really to think about, even as we are talking present day around how we're framing ideas around race and intersectionality and conversations about systems, that very often the framing is around law enforcement and what is our engagement with law enforcement. And it's critical to look at that, but to also look at systems generally, and not to replace one response with another that can be equally as harmful in the lives of women of color. And so when we think about like the child welfare system, children of color are overrepresented in the child welfare system. Mothers of color are losing their children at astronomical rates in that system. When we look at counseling and therapy services, certainly important, but you look at the rates of medication and the ways that medication is used and weaponized against our communities. When you look at the education system and who's being suspended disparately, again, you see that young girls of color are overrepresented and males of color are overrepresented in these numbers. So we have to look at systems critically, and we have to look at, the roots of domestic violence are about power. And anytime that you're engaged with a system that has power over a community or power over particular people, you begin to see those same intersections, right? And so when we look at, an analysis of how intersectionality shows up, how racism shows up, it is really looking at how we dismantle power and how we ensure that power cannot be used to then subjugate, a group of people. And so in our programs, we see this every day, in terms of access to services. We see that women of color, have different disparate responses, and both Sarai and Qudsia talked about that. It's everything from, judging the way we parent in programs, to looking at, I used to do work with a national grant program. And one of the things I saw is that when you were talking about women of color gaining economic access, they were doing job training programs. When you weren't talking about women of color, it was career development, right? And so just even the disparate way that we think about economics and how we, in our relationships to economics is important. I think when we're talking about racism is to know that it's ingrained in the systems that we all use, right? And so it requires a deep analysis of the way that we're framing our response, the kinds of responses and remedies that we're providing for survivors, and recognizing that racism is sort of ingrained in those systems, and then being able to, as those individuals that are helping survivors navigate them, that we're very clear about what the impact will be for the women that we're helping. So for instance, if my referral is for you to access law enforcement, as both Sarai and Qudsia said, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for my community? What are the historical challenges and what are the present day challenges? Because one of the things that we also see, particularly for women of color, is that things get personalized rather than recognizing that there's a systemic issue, right? So you say, oh, she's this angry Black woman, or oh, there's this particular issue that this person has with this system, rather than understanding that there's an underlying root reason, right? And that they're not just having this individual reaction, it is a reaction for their community based on actual historical premise. These are actual interactions and long-standing interactions that the community has had with these systems, right? And that's showing up in their responses.
Thank you. That was so powerful because that kind of summed up why we were doing this. So, Dr. Crain, if you could really talk about how your organizations, whether or not your current one or your past one, have been addressing this intersection, that would be great.
So happy to speak to that. And I'll speak to both just because my most recent appointment as deputy chief is new, and I'm actually really excited about the ways that this conversation has been embedded. And there's actually, through the city of Oakland actually has a Department of Race and Equity, which is a standalone department with a director. And now, you know, the movement around, you know, defunding and divesting and all of this has really centered this discourse where now a lot of the initiatives that are being proposed, they have to go through that department just to make sure that there's an equity lens on it. Doesn't sound like that should be happening at this point, but that's just kind of where we're at, so we can take it. But I want to go back and speak to my experience taking over the helm at Baywar, because when I came in, I guess that was 4.5 years ago when I first got there, the previous executive director had been there for 37 years. So she was part of that original white feminist movement. You know, wonderful woman who, you know, gave her life 37 years, you know, to leadership to the organization. And she didn't start as an executive director. She started, you know, as an advocate who was part of a co-op of women who were really just working with survivors. They had one telephone, and that was the hotline that people used and accessed. And so it was, you know, I get that, and I really appreciate it. And again, I would never dismiss the legacy, but there was no intentionality around making sure that there was strategic outreach to people of color. So when I got there, I was the first executive of color in the agency's history. And at that point, it was 45 years old. The first executive of color in 45 years in the liberal Bay Area. So let's just digest that and look at how problematic that whole idea around, you know, it's like, well, I have Black friends, and I have, you know, I hired this Black person, and I have a Black friend over here and a Black friend over here. But then we're looking at, there was this huge gap in how, you know, Black and brown folks were accessing services differently. And so there was a program that was established to make sure that our services that were offered in English were offered in Spanish. I mean, we're in California, so there's a lot of folks here that, you know, are either monolingual or bilingual, where English, you know, is not their first language. And, you know, but they were, you know, they were getting paid less than their white counterparts. They were, and this is the stuff that I discovered when I became executive director. So my first, I call it intense moment of fellowship with my board was when I had to check them around the fact that I wasn't going to lead an organization that was comfortable paying the brown folks less money than their white counterparts. So that, you know, that got addressed. And then it was just like, yes, I am going to be hiring, you know, people that look like the folks that live in Oakland, California. Yes, I am going to make sure that there is equity around how we even do recruitment for our volunteer base. You know, if we're going to have people on the hotline or responding in the emergency department, then they need to look like the people that live here. They also need to be spreading the word and making sure that folks that are trying to access resources, that they know that this is available, making sure that the individuals that, you know, even when in the interview process, so you want to work here, what is your equity lens? What do you know, what do you know about Black folks? I'm happy to hire, you know, blonde hair and blue eyes, but where did you grow up, and do you understand that this is an issue that is, you know, plaguing this agency? And let's talk about it with honesty, with transparency, and without apology. I think that a lot of folks, especially when I first came, they say, oh, they're so excited that there was, you know, a Black woman who was coming to be the new executive director, but it got a little uncomfortable when, you know, some of those feathers started rustling and decisions had to be made at the agency and systemic and financial level. So when, you know, now this person is going to make as much money as you are. And again, this is all private, confidential stuff when you're talking about labor and employment. But again, I wasn't going to, like, I mean, just at that fundamental level. And again, the person who preceded me would never in a million years think she was a racist, but the system had become toxic. And so now, yeah, we've got, you know, the whole gender equity piece, and we recognize gender nonconforming folks, but even still, there were no services that were centering queer and trans folks. And this is the Bay Area.
So it's like,
those are some of the things that just decisions had to be made at an agency level unapologetically to make sure that access was being reached and access was being made available for individuals that had not been previously served and actually reflected the demographic of the county.
Qudsia, you're with the National Domestic the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and you serve on a few boards. Could you really tell us about how those organizations are addressing this intersection?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the hotline first, since you know, that's where I'm employed. And my position actually shifted recently, well, a couple months ago, to specifically work on what racial equity looks like at the hotline. So yeah, for us, like we've been on this journey. Like, we're not perfect. We're a national organization, so like, you know, all of that. But we have been doing a lot of good, not only just focusing externally, but then internally as well, because like we also are really focused on, I know I am very deeply invested in making sure that we're making the workplace, you know, because like one of the issues is like, okay, well, you're the National DV Hotline, and you work with like a variety of different communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, like hire all of these people of color, et cetera, which is great. Like, we should have a diverse lineup of advocates. You should have a diverse lineup of like folks within leadership. But are we looking at how we're retaining staff? And when we talk about retention, it's like, is it a safe place to work? And so we've been doing a lot of that work very intentionally and very like intensely focusing with a racial equity lens, and happy to give examples of that. But, you know, for example, right now, like, you know, we're looking at the culture, the political climate we're in. We're looking at like the impact of secondary trauma on folks of color that work with us, that work on staff. So we're in the process of creating, like, we're creating race-based affinity groups to have like safe spaces to talk. We've also invested in a facilitator that comes in once a month and it's a safe space for Black staff only. And it's understood that we're not creating those for everybody. But it's there, and it's like, it's separate from the affinity group. It is there for like healing and joy and like to talk about racial trauma, and that's been going really well. But like, just reminding ourselves that like, this is not just a place of work, but like, it is. And how are we making it safe? Recognizing that like how we show up at work is just different, right? Like, we're hearing a lot from advocates right now about how politics are seeping into conversations. And so we're trying to figure out right now, how do we, again, like, you know, it's one thing to just like say racist things, but then they don't know who's behind the phone or who's behind the chat. And it's real people. It's people that like experience racism, you know, so we're working through that. We're like providing wellness spaces for folks to figure that out. And then in terms of like how we work with survivors, I mean, you know, we use the crisis intervention model where, you know, our training staff, we get made fun of, but our training is now 95 hours. And it's because, you know, it is what it is, but it's because like we're constantly adding pieces that bring in a specific focus on all of these various intersections, because it can't be an afterthought, right? And like, we're just committed. We're like, you know what, if you're signing up to do this work, you have to sign up for like the complications of like scenarios you're gonna have to deal with and the various communities you're gonna have to deal with. So, you know, we thread it throughout. We're currently working right now on you know, just like racial equity training that we're working with. I'm very excited to be working with Alicia Sanchez-Gill. She's creating it for us, really centering like Black and Brown survivors. So that's how we're trying to show up in this way, like just really making sure that we're threading a racial equity lens in everything that we do, every email that goes out, every message that goes out. Like, what are ways that we can not just do a all lives matter situation, but like really center people that are most at harm. And like, I think sometimes at domestic violence organizations, or, you know, just any nonprofit, the focus is always external, like, oh, the survivor over there. But so many of us are survivors. So many of us, you know, like, we show up with so many identities. And so we need to remind ourselves that not only do we need to provide excellent services for people that are reaching out to us, but that we need to make sure that, that we're creating safe environments for people to work in, so that we can have diverse populations of people. There's a reason why there's a pipeline of, you know, women of color entering and leaving these spaces. And so we're really focusing a lot on that, and excited that we're doing this. Yeah.
All right. Karma, if you could address that intersection as well.
Sure. So as an organization, I represent both UJIMA, which is the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black community, and it's kind of just germane to what we do to address intersectionality, to look at systemic racism and structural racism, and to really focus on how our organizations, domestic violence organizations, are addressing these issues, to do and look at systems, how systems are responding to survivors, and particularly survivors of color, from a policy perspective, looking at ensuring that policies are informed by the realities of women of color, and particularly, both the big P and little p in decision making within our agencies. We very often set policies about Black and Brown communities without ever inviting Black and Brown communities to be a part of the decision-making process. And so really looking at how do we infuse our realities in every part of decision-making, right? Just in talking about shelters, is looking at, everything from, like we talked about earlier, what are we talking about parenting? What kind of foods do we offer in our programs? What holidays do we, reserve as organizations? What kind, what's the diversity? And also when we look at people of color, very often we silo us. And so we say, oh, well, these are Black folks, or oh, these are Latina, and, and we don't also then recognize the diversity within our communities. So just because I am an African-American woman who grew up in the sort of mid-Atlantic area, I have a different perspective and reality from a Black woman born and raised in the Caribbean. And so really just understanding the diversity that exists within all of our communities of color, and that those realities then impact the way that we seek services, the traumas that we are coming to our programs with, our experiences, our lived realities, and how all of that shows up in programming. And then from a coalition perspective, we have really been intentional around looking at racism, structural and intersectionality. So that's been everything from, our training materials. Are the harm doers always Black men? Are the survivors always Black women? Do we show the diversity of experiences? When we're looking at funding, Sarai and Qudsia talked, and I think it's really critically important for us to not always look outside, to look internal to our organization. How are we paying the folks of color the same as we're paying others? What positions do the people of color hold in our organizations? If all the frontline staff are people of color and nobody in management and executive leadership are, and we saw this with COVID, that all of the folks who were essential workers and risking themselves on a day-to-day basis were people of, not all, but we had this disparate impact on communities of color, right? And so we see that too in our programming. And then lastly, really looking at access to resources. We really took stock in, those culturally specific organizations in the district. Were they receiving the same slice of funding that mainstream organizations was receiving? And we found no, they were, under-resourced and almost receiving 3 times less the amount that the mainstream organization was. And so we had to create a policy strategy to ensure that they had access to additional resources. And so that then gets to this point that Sarai brought up, that it's great to have a person of color in a position as long as they are carrying the mantle in a specific way. But when we really do our work, it means that there's going to be a shift in resources and a shift in power. And so that really is the framing that we really have taken on, because that makes folks uncomfortable.
Well, you guys have all shared so many powerful things. And so I know that the audience is probably thinking, what can I as an individual or as part of my faith community do around this intersection? Like, what can individuals or faith communities do now that they are even aware of this issue that they may not have been aware of before? So Dr. Crain?
I'm extremely passionate about this piece, primarily because I have been in spaces professionally and in vocational ministry in spaces that were homogenous, traditional homogenous Black congregations, as well as, of like multicultural kind of, diverse spaces. And I also just want to say that I bring, a background, deeply rooted in the Israelite tradition, and, much appreciation and gratitude and just ecclesial respect for just interfaith spaces that I've been in, studied in, and have continued to do work in partnership alongside. So I bring all of that to the spaces that I've served. But I think particularly when I was in the multicultural congregation where I served, and this was a large congregation. The senior founding pastor was actually a Black man, but it was, I hadn't seen anything like it in terms of the type of, cultural diversity and also faith diversity that folks brought coming into the space. And so it kind of turned into this, we're all the human race and we all bleed red. And, when I see you, I don't see your ethnicity. And so I was like, hold on. When I came on staff, I'm like, hold up. Yes, you do. You see these big old lips. You see all of the ways that my Black and Indigenous blood show up in the ways that I look physically. So let's stop with the whole I don't see race foolishness. And I recognize the privilege that I have, with fairer skin, and that's a whole other conversation. But I think to answer the question around what happens in congregational spaces, I learned after I became a member of the executive staff there that the governing board was all male. And I didn't know that. And I feel like if I had known that beforehand, I wouldn't have taken the job. And, in some bizarre theological way, I've been able to make peace with the fact that I really needed to do some work to disrupt and interrupt some of the, status quo that existed there. And so when I talked about the fact that I was, one of 2 ordained women on executive staff, and there were 17 of us, that I was the highest credentialed, but definitely the lowest paid. The fact that there were no services that were specific, for, Black, Indigenous people of color, especially that had experienced intimate violence. When I took to task a situation that came up with a couple that was in crisis, I had a couple that showed up one morning, and, this is 5,000 people. So you're talking, multiple services on the weekends, it's a lot going on. And this man beat his wife in the parking lot and got out. She has a bloody nose, and they were expecting to serve that day. And when it came up amongst the executive staff, it seemed like this shock that I was saying, like, she could have been killed. He's pummeling her in the parking lot. This didn't happen at home. And so really having to challenge what was going on, but seeing how much resistance I got, I think that's what really fueled, my own passion around doing work academically and scholastically, to really look at the ways that we do not take the violence against women in the biblical text, specifically in the Hebrew Bible, where we're not really looking at that. And we talk about biblical literacy, but then we're not preaching about the texts that are, explicitly about, domestic violence, sexual violence. And all the problems that we see, even the way that the text has been held and taught. And so for me, I'm like, listen, you hired me. So if I'm going to do Bible study, I'm going to do it my way. So it's like, really disrupting that. And so for some folks, it was great. I was able to help a lot of people. I started groups. And then at a certain point, I was doing groups for survivors and making sure that they had it. But then the need got, outgrew my own capacity. So I'm trying to duplicate myself and other folks so that they can, so we could have other, concurrent groups, and hopefully that it would live on. But the resistance that I got in this multicultural, we're all one, we love each other. And I was advised professionally not to say anything about anything political. And mind you, I was there when Barack Obama was inaugurated, and I had to take the day off, okay, because it was not appropriate for me to talk about any of that or my own celebration, because we were in this multicultural, diverse space, and we just need to remain neutral and keep Jesus at the center. And I'm like, what? So it just kind of turned into like this real passion and fervor around taking the church to task. and really asking the questions, and then being invited into other spaces, and then going on to the seminary level and having, you know, being invited in those spaces where now we're talking not just, you know, in the local congregation, but what does seminary education have to say about this? These weren't offered when I was taking classes, when I was doing my master's or my doctorate. So I think that, to answer your question, and I'll end it here, that there just has to be enough of us that are willing to be disruptive, willing to have those, you know, those labels. Because of course I got called, you know, the raging feminist, the liberalist, the, you know, all of the problematic labels that come when you actually are about disrupting the status quo and the toxic, patriarchal, systemic, racist ways that the text is handled and that the even structure of the church is managed. And so some people wonder, like, well, how are you not a full-time pastor anymore? It's like, well, if that's what I have to look forward to, I'm good. I'll take my ministry and expand it into spaces where I'm actually seeing change and actually seeing systems disrupted. I'll park there and let my other sisters go in my place.
Qudsia, what can people do?
I would come to that church, would follow you. I'm convinced. Yeah, I have so many horrific stories from, like, you know, times when I was a baby advocate and was working in Muslim spaces. I identify as Muslim and was told not to come back to mosques, and, you know, just for passing out 101 information on, like, this is domestic violence. So 3 things. One is, as folks that work within religious communities or have congregations or whatever, know the resources that exist in your community. Like, if I were to ask any one of you, like, who's your local DV provider or whatever, you should know that. You should know somebody there. And if you don't, get to know them. Also, just a reminder that you don't have to know everything. I know that sometimes people rely on religious spaces as, like, the one-stop shop for everything. And while I think it's great that that's seen as a safe space, know that you don't have to be the expert. Like, it's good that people are sharing with you. You can pass that on. And you can do that by building that relationship, right? Because a lot of times that's where a lot of harm ends up happening when folks are given, you know, because then you can get into, like, theological this and that. And I'm like, no, we don't need to do that. We don't need to do that. I know all of it, like, learned so much from KARAMAH, doing that, like, you know, getting into theological whatnot. But at the end of the day, like, there are people that do this work, connect them. Also, my other thing is that don't wait for something tragic to happen to bring somebody in, right? Make it a normal thing. Make it a normal thing within your congregation, within your place of worship, to just like, oh, well, they're here again. The DV folks are here again. The FA folks are here again. It should be a normal thing. Normalize it, because in that way, like, people will feel comfortable talking about it and not wait for something, like, really horrific to happen before you're like, oh, we condemn it. Cool, but are you normalizing it at your place of worship, right? And then 2 more things I'm going to say is that I did say that you're not the expert, but I do think that a lot of times we over-rely on systems to solve basic conflict. So I would encourage you, and this is where I'll talk about CAS, Collective Action for Safe Spaces, and this is not the only organization that does it, but look into bystander intervention. If you don't know how to do it, just Google it, look for an organization. You can even read about it online. But if you can de-escalate a situation, you can de-escalate a lot of conflict without having to call the cops, without having to call an outside whatever. And I think that's a really good skill to have in life in general, but particularly for situations like this. And then the last thing I'll say is information and data are always important. And one thing that the hotline is able to do is surveys. And so we do surveys pretty regularly on a variety of different issues. We are working on one right now with, in partnership with Heart Women and Girls, who do work in Muslim communities around sexual assault. But we're putting one together right now on how survivors are able to navigate, just the intersection of faith and domestic violence. It's going to be launching on our website on November 1st. And so really want to make sure it captures a broad swath of people and congregations and faith traditions. And so be on the lookout for that. We would love input because the more information we have, the better our services can become. So those are the 3 things I wanted to share.
All right. And Karma, as our last person to wrap up.
Sure. I mean, I think that my sisters have said it. I mean, they really have sort of lifted up what we would say to faith communities. I think the only thing that I would add is that, faith leaders and faith communities have a long history of being social justice centers, right? The folks who make change in community and lead around social justice issues. And so this can't be the place where we're silent. We have there is a place for accountability. There is a place for leadership. Really, faith communities lead around healing and what healing looks like for survivors. You know, they tend to be and are very often one of the very first places that either gets to see that a situation is happening or where there is disclosure. And so knowing, as Qudsia said, knowing the resources in your community, knowing what your community needs are. Dr. Crain lifted up this idea of really shaking things up and being the truth speakers. And we need our faith leaders to do that, right? And take stock of the systems that we've built even in religious communities, because there are times when we do manifest and do then model those same systems of oppression that we're seeing outside. And so being able to look and not just talk the talk, but walk the walk, right, around all of those places, because whether we accept it or not, and I say this to folks all the time, regardless of whether you accept it or not, you are a leader, right? Folks look to you as a leader. They are looking to, especially in faith settings, they are looking to our faith leaders to set examples. And so we know, of course, we're all people, and so certainly none of us are perfect, but recognizing that we have a role in that space as leaders, being one, educated, and then two, being accountable is critically important. And the opportunities for self-reflection, we've got to be able to, especially as faith communities, model the premise around self-reflection and being able to be open when folks are raising issues around questions of leadership, who's in leadership, how folks show up in leadership, what individuals' interactions are with their faith leaders, being able to have a structure and a place where they can lift those up, particularly for survivors, right? Because what we know for survivors is at the point that we are disclosing, at the point that survivors are actually coming to disclose, they have felt some level of danger. They're not just disclosing before and opening and having conversations about the level of danger that they feel. At the point that they are actually disclosing, then they have experienced some level of danger. And so it is critical and important that we know how to respond in those moments, right? And then that we recognize that there are also harm doers amongst us. And so what process do we have in place as faith communities to reinforce a level of accountability? And as Qudsia said, it's not just, it is also about bystander, being trained around bystander responses, understanding what that looks like, and then also the systems of accountability. What are you saying from the pulpit? What are you saying from the space of leadership in your faith community that reinforces accountability when one is a harm doer, right? And then I know I started with this idea of social justice, but I will just end there, because really this is about shifting social norms. And there is no better place to do that in faith communities. And they have such a long history around that, whether you're talking about from at the abolitionist movement to the civil rights movement to now. And so reclaiming that history is critically important for faith communities.
Okay, so we have some questions from the audience now. And so one of them is, what are your thoughts on focused deterrence as a law enforcement strategy targeted at perpetrators? So they're saying focused deterrence allows police to notify DV perpetrators, face-to-face notifications for reoffenders. Would this be worth increasing police power? So if anyone wants to comment on basically increasing police power because it's a focused strategy of law enforcement. Anybody want to address that?
Anyone? I mean, I would just say that anything, okay. I just, the way that Mariam Kaba would frame this is that anything that increases the power of the police is not something that is going to increase any kind of safety for survivors. And so I would say that any kind of solution, even though it may seem like something that, you know, oh yeah, let's just do it in this one way. Like, again, just because somebody's a perpetrator, right? Like, just because somebody's doesn't mean that we're not worried about their safety either, right? And so I wouldn't want law enforcement responding or, yeah, I don't know, I just have too many jumbled thoughts, but at the end of the day, I don't think any kind of police response is a good one. And I think anything that increases the power of them just means that we don't have the imagination to think outside of law enforcement, right? Like, there are so many ways that we haven't even thought of, but we've limited our scope and thought of like, oh, increase, decrease, increase, decrease. And I'm like, okay, how many more examples, how many more people dead do we need to see before we're like, okay, let's think of something new, let's imagine something new. And there are so many communities that are practicing, different ways of being and different ways for showing up for survivors. So I would just say, like, do some research, think outside of the box, and just, like, the answer isn't always funneling that money to law enforcement. We could funnel that money to other organizations that don't have the funding, but have the thinking of how these problems can be fixed. So yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah,
Okay.
I 100% agree and really appreciate that. And I would also add that, that it is documented that increasing, the law enforcement piece does not equal safety or more safety. There's not just kind of this direct correlation, and that's the myth that we have, that increased, punishment and penalization of individuals that cause harm equals more safety for individuals that have experienced harm. It's just a myth. So no.
Okay. We have a couple more questions. I think we have time for one more question. And so the question I think we're going to end with is, what are some of the unique barriers that faith communities face when addressing issues of domestic violence, and how can we work to proactively address those barriers?
Can you repeat the question? I'm so sorry.
So what are some of the unique barriers that faith communities face when addressing issues of domestic violence, and how can we work to proactively address those barriers?
I would say the number one barrier really is a lack of information and like a lack of information and knowledge around processes. It's just widely known that if you were to poll 1,000 pastors about like their relationships with their local crisis center, their intimate knowledge of what, crisis hotlines or resources or shelters or agencies that provide services to victims, that the vast majority of them would say that they just don't have it. And so I think that that's one of the key issues. When I became certified as a sexual assault counselor 17 years ago, I was the first one in the agency's history, and it had been over 30 years. So you're talking about just a disconnect between faith leaders, lay leaders, and folks that have some level of influence, just not having a partnership with their local agencies, and they just don't even understand. So I would start there. It looked like Karma had a.
Yeah.
Well, and I was just lifting that up. Absolutely. And I think, outside of that, it's also just a lack of understanding about the dynamics of domestic violence, how it shows up, and what the remedies are. So, very often for faith communities, it's understanding that domestic violence is cyclical. It is an example of power and control. It's not situational. It's not, I had a drink last night and now I am engaging in an act of violence. That these things, are long-standing issues. They happen in cycles, and that the root of them is about power and control. It's not just there is this situation that happened and now I need to respond to this situation. And they're really understanding and being able to talk through safety. What does safety mean? How we do some of the basic things like establishing relationships with community, knowing what the resources are, and then the basic level of safety planning, right? Having just that level of information is critical, especially in faith contexts, because like we said earlier, very often you might be the first place that an individual is disclosing. And so getting to know, and one of the things that, we hear when we do outreach with faith communities is just, how do I know that this is the right partnership? I might outreach to this domestic violence organization, but how do we know that this is the right organization? How do we know that they prescribe to the same values? How do do we know that they understand where we're going to be coming from? And one of the things we say is it's try, you know, it's engaging in a partnership. And so there has to be that base level of trust from the beginning, but understanding that domestic violence organizations are not necessarily looking to, you know, disrupt the family structure. They're about keeping families safe, and just understanding that basic premise.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great stopping place for this first series, first part of the 4-part series. I want to remind folks that they can still register for the other 3 parts. Next week, we'll be honoring Indigenous People Day and really talking about the unique needs of Indian country, because if you are not aware, it's not to be missed, because it is something that even people in this space don't really know a lot of information about. So I want to thank all the panelists. Thank you for taking time out of your super busy schedule to share with us and help us kick off the Interfaith Coalition's 4-part webinar series. So thank you guys very much, and everyone have a good day. Please stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.